Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corin. I'd love to chat today about the topic we talked about, what kind of a speaker you might want to get something like a podcast played around a room for 360-degree sound. And I guess the much more sophisticated level of that technology would be surround sound. And I'd love to chat today about all those related technologies, both surround sound, typically associated with cinemas, the Dolby standards, and getting those immersive experiences. But we're seeing these days Dolby branching out a bit, as well as cinemas, of course. The kind of real audiophile world would be a big base of theirs, with some people having these really nice DACs at home and often actually resembling cinemas in their house. But Dolby are bringing their tech down into more consumer devices. At least I've noticed that the phone I'm recording on actually has some setting to do with Dolby, and my laptop does. And I always assumed that these were kind of really dubiously useful, because it seems like a big stretch to expect any decent audio from something like a laptop. But they're definitely going in that direction. The other more middle ground solution that might be more practical for most people is the soundbar. And soundbars come in a lot of different price points, from the very, very low end stuff that you might find on AliExpress, totally generic, through to they get very expensive, but they can be made by really legit and very established names in audio. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to know firstly about the evolution of surround sound in general, the Dolby standards, and with AI as well, there's a growing amount of technology in sound that tries to create these room experiences using simply using software and some kind of sensing technology. So instead of putting a bunch of physical speakers around the place, for these systems we're using one speaker, trying to figure out what the room looks like and putting the sound out in a way that makes it feel immersive. And I guess if you had the choice between rigging up a bunch of speakers and having one with this, most people would probably, non-audiophiles at least, would probably opt for the single speaker that has this. So Herman and Corin, let's talk about all those topics in today's episode.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corin, and I am joined as always by my brother, who I am pretty sure spent his entire weekend recalibrating his home theater system for the 11th time this month. I walked past his house on Saturday, and I could hear white noise bursts and sine wave sweeps from the sidewalk.
Herman Poppleberry here, and for your information, it was the 12th time if you count the quick subwoofer phase adjustment I did on Sunday morning. But in my defense, I moved a bookshelf 3 inches to the left to make room for a new floor lamp, and that completely changed the acoustic reflections in the mid-range frequencies. You cannot just ignore physics, Corn. If the standing waves are not managed, the entire soundstage collapses.
Of course not. Heaven forbid the sound waves do not hit your ears at the exact microsecond intended by the sound engineer. I honestly do not know how you sleep at night knowing there might be a 2 decibel dip at 80 Hz in the back corner of your room. Well, you are in luck today, because Daniel sent us a prompt that is right up your alley. He wants us to dive into the world of 360-degree sound, the evolution of surround sound standards like Dolby, and how we have gone from massive cinema setups to having spatial audio on our phones and laptops.
It is such a fascinating transition, especially looking at where we are now in early 2026. We are living through a period where the barrier between professional cinema audio and what you can get in your pocket is shrinking, at least on the software side. I have been following the development of object-based audio for over a decade, and seeing it hit the mainstream through things like the latest smartphones and spatial computing headsets is one of those things that makes me really appreciate the engineering that goes into consumer electronics.
It is interesting because for a long time, surround sound was this very rigid, physical thing. You had 5 speakers and a subwoofer, or 7 speakers, and they had to be in very specific spots. If you did not have the wires running through your walls or under your rug, you were out of luck. It was a hobby for people with dedicated basements and a lot of patience. But now, the whole concept seems to be shifting away from where the speakers are, and more toward how the sound is processed.
Exactly. That is the fundamental shift from channel-based audio to object-based audio. We should probably define those because they are the foundation of everything we are talking about today. In the old days, like with early Dolby Digital or DTS in the 1990s, the sound engineer would decide, okay, this explosion sound goes to the rear left speaker and this dialogue goes to the center channel. It was baked into the file. If you did not have a rear left speaker, that sound just got folded into the front speakers and the immersion was broken. But with something like Dolby Atmos, which really changed the game starting in theaters around 2012, the engineer does not assign sound to speakers. They assign sound to an object at a specific point in three-dimensional space.
So the file itself says there is a bird chirping at these specific X, Y, and Z coordinates, and then your specific hardware has to figure out how to represent that based on what you actually have plugged in.
Whether you have 2 speakers in a laptop, a high-end soundbar, or a 24-speaker home theater with height channels, the processor looks at your setup and says, okay, to make it sound like that bird is 10 feet up and 3 feet to the right, I need to use these specific drivers at these specific volumes and phases. It is much more flexible and scalable. It is the difference between a painting, where the colors are fixed on the canvas, and a 3-dimensional video game engine, where the objects can be viewed from any angle.
I want to get into the technical side of how a tiny laptop can even pretend to do that, but let us look at the history for a second. We went from mono to stereo, which was the big revolution in the mid-20th century. Then we had that weird quadraphonic era in the 70s that failed miserably. Then we got into the 5.1 era in the 90s. What was the catalyst that pushed us toward this 360-degree immersive sound we have now? Was it just better processing power? Or was there a specific industry push?
It was a bit of both. Processing power is a huge part of it, but it was also driven by the cinema industry wanting to stay ahead of home theaters. In the early 2000s, home theaters were getting good enough that people were staying home. So the industry pushed for height channels. That was the big leap. Traditional surround sound was a flat plane. It was all around you, but nothing was ever above you. When Dolby Atmos was introduced, it added those overhead speakers. Suddenly, you were in a bubble of sound, not just a circle. But the real aha moment for the industry was realizing that they could use this same object-based metadata to simulate that bubble on much smaller devices using math.
I remember the first time I saw a movie in a theater with Atmos. It was a rain scene, and it actually felt like the water was hitting a roof above my head. It is a very visceral feeling. But then, almost immediately, we started seeing that logo on smartphones. I remember seeing a phone box that said Dolby Atmos, and I thought, there is no way. This phone has 2 tiny speakers at the bottom that are the size of a grain of rice. How is that even remotely the same thing? Is it just marketing?
That is where the skepticism is totally justified, but the science behind it is actually pretty cool. It is all about something called the head-related transfer function, or HRTF. Basically, your brain figures out where a sound is coming from based on how it hits your outer ears, your pinna. A sound coming from behind you sounds different than a sound coming from in front of you, because your ears are shaped to filter high frequencies differently depending on the angle. Your brain has spent your entire life learning these filters.
Right, because the back of my ear is physically blocking or reflecting some of the sound if it is coming from behind me. It changes the color of the sound.
Exactly. And there is also the timing difference, known as interaural time difference. If a sound is to your right, it hits your right ear a fraction of a millisecond before it hits your left ear. Digital signal processing can now mimic those filters and timing delays so effectively that it tricks your brain into thinking a sound is coming from behind you, even if it is actually coming from a screen 6 inches in front of your face. When you put on headphones, this effect becomes even more powerful because the software has total control over what each ear hears.
So when I see the Dolby logo on my laptop or my tablet, it is not just a marketing gimmick. There is actually a complex algorithm trying to simulate those ear filters in real time.
It is a bit of both. The logo means the device is capable of decoding the Atmos metadata and applying those HRTF filters. But, and this is a big but, the quality of the speakers still matters. If you have tiny, tinny speakers that cannot produce a wide range of frequencies, the effect is going to be weak. You need a certain amount of clarity and frequency response for your brain to accept the trick. That is why spatial audio usually sounds way better on high-quality headphones than on laptop speakers. With headphones, the manufacturer knows exactly where the speakers are in relation to your ears. They are literally strapped to them, so the math is much easier.
That makes sense. With a laptop, the manufacturer does not know if I am sitting 2 feet away or 5 feet away, or if I am in a room with high ceilings or lots of soft furniture that might be absorbing the sound.
Right. And that brings us to the middle ground Daniel mentioned in his prompt, which is the soundbar. I think soundbars are one of the most interesting pieces of tech right now because they are trying to solve a massive physics problem. Most people do not want to run wires for 7 or 9 speakers. They want one box under the TV. So, soundbar engineers use something called beamforming.
I have heard that term in relation to Wi-Fi routers, where they aim the signal at your device. How does it work with actual physical sound waves?
It is the same principle. By using an array of multiple small speakers, sometimes 15 or 20 of them in a single bar, and controlling the timing of each one very precisely, you can create constructive and destructive interference. You can literally aim a beam of sound so that it bounces off your sidewall and hits your ear from the side. To your brain, it sounds like there is a speaker on that wall, even though the sound originated from under your TV. The same goes for the ceiling. Many Atmos soundbars have up-firing drivers that bounce sound off the ceiling to create that height effect.
That sounds incredibly fragile, Herman. Like, if I have a big heavy curtain on one wall and a glass window on the other, wouldn't the sound bounce differently? One side would be muffled and the other would be bright.
It does. And that is why the high-end soundbars now come with sophisticated microphones and room calibration software. When you set them up, they play a series of sweeps and chirps. They listen to how those sounds bounce around the room, and they build a digital map of your acoustic environment. If the left wall is more absorbent than the right wall, the processor will boost the volume or change the EQ of the left firing beam to compensate. It is doing real-time acoustic engineering that used to take a professional with a tripod and a laptop hours to do.
It is amazing that we have reached a point where software can compensate for the physical limitations of a living room. But let us talk about the move towards single-speaker immersion. I have seen some of these new smart speakers, like the ones from Apple, Sony, and Sonos, that claim to fill a room with 360-degree sound from just one cylindrical unit. Is that just a fancy way of saying the speaker points in all directions, or is there more to it?
There is definitely more to it. If you just have a speaker that points in all directions, you get what we call omnidirectional sound. It fills the room, but it is not immersive. It is just loud everywhere, like a mono radio from the 50s. The real magic happens when you use AI and sensing technology to do what we call computational audio. Companies like Apple with the HomePod or Sony with their 360 reality audio systems are using built-in microphones to constantly monitor the reflected sound. They are not just mapping the room once, they are doing it continuously.
So, if I move the speaker from the kitchen counter to a bookshelf in the corner, it knows.
Within seconds, it detects the change in the reflection patterns and adjusts its internal EQ and beamforming. Some of the newer systems are even using ultrasonic sensors or the LiDAR cameras on your phone during setup to see exactly where the walls and furniture are. The goal is to create a wide soundstage where instruments feel like they are placed in specific spots in the room rather than just coming from a single point. It is trying to recreate the phantom center and the stereo width that you usually need 2 speakers for.
I find the AI aspect of this really interesting, because it is not just about measuring the room, right? It is about interpreting the audio itself. I have read about systems that use machine learning to identify the different parts of a song, like the vocals, the drums, and the reverb, and then they treat those parts differently in the spatial mix.
Yes, that is exactly where the cutting edge is in 2026. If you are playing an old stereo recording from the 1960s that was never meant for surround sound, these AI systems can perform what is called upmixing. They use neural networks to identify the ambient sound, like the natural echo of the recording studio or the applause in a live track, and they steer that toward the walls and ceiling to create a sense of space. Meanwhile, they keep the dry vocals locked in the center. It is essentially hallucinating a three-dimensional space based on cues in the two-dimensional recording.
Hallucinating is a great word for it. It is like what AI does with images, filling in the gaps based on what it thinks should be there. But does that not bother the purists? I can imagine an audiophile, maybe someone like you on a particularly grumpy day, saying, "That is not what the artist intended. You are adding artificial space to the music."
Oh, the audiophile forums are absolutely on fire with those debates. And they have a point. If you are a purist, you want two high-quality speakers and a perfect equilateral triangle between them and your head. That is, the reference experience. But the reality is that most people do not listen to music that way. They listen while they are cooking, or moving around the house, or sitting on a couch that is not perfectly centered. Computational audio makes the sweet spot much larger. It makes the music sound good in more places. It is the democratization of good sound. You do not need a dedicated listening room and $10,000 of equipment to get an immersive experience anymore. You just need a decent speaker and some very clever code.
I like that phrase, the democratization of sound. But I want to push back on the single speaker thing. Can one speaker really replace a 5.1 system? Even with all the AI in the world, can it really make me feel like a car is driving past me from left to right?
To be honest, a single speaker will never be as good as physical speakers placed behind you. Physics is a stubborn thing. However, what these single speakers are getting very good at is verticality and width. They can make a room feel much larger than it is. But for that true behind you feeling, you still usually need at least a soundbar with rear satellites. That said, the gap is closing. We are starting to see distributed systems where you can buy one speaker now and add another later, and the AI automatically reconfigures the entire soundstage to use both of them in a coordinated way.
That sounds like a much more consumer-friendly way to build a system. You don't have to buy the whole refrigerator-sized setup at once. But what about the future? We have talked about where we are, but where does this go next? If software is taking over, what is the next leap?
The next leap is personalized, tracked audio. We are already seeing this with headphones. If you wear high-end earbuds, they use accelerometers to track your head movement. If you turn your head to the left, the center of the sound stays anchored to your TV screen. It is incredibly convincing. The next step is doing that in a room without headphones. Imagine a speaker system that uses a small camera or a millimeter wave radar sensor to see exactly where you are sitting. If you move to the left side of the couch, the beamforming array shifts the entire spatial image in real time so that you are always in the perfect sweet spot.
That sounds a bit like something out of a science fiction movie. The sound follows you around like a spotlight.
Exactly. And it could even work for multiple people. The system could create a private sound zone for you while someone else on the other side of the room hears something completely different, or at least a different mix. We are moving toward a world where sound is not something that happens at you, but something that exists around you, adapting to your presence and the physical layout of your life.
Let us talk about the practical side for a second. If someone is looking to upgrade their home setup and they are overwhelmed by all these standards, Dolby Atmos, DTS-X, Sony, 360 Reality Audio, MPEG-H, does it actually matter which one they choose? Or is everything becoming cross-compatible?
For the most part, Dolby Atmos is the clear winner in terms of content availability. Almost every major streaming service, from Netflix to Disney Plus to Apple Music and Tidal, supports Atmos. DTS-X is great, and some people prefer it, especially on physical media like Blu-rays, because it is often lossless, meaning no data is compressed. But for the average person streaming movies and music, Atmos is the one you want to look for. The good news is that most high-quality soundbars and receivers in 2026 now support both, so you do not really have to choose.
And what about the hardware? If I am on a budget, is a cheap Atmos-enabled soundbar actually better than a really good older stereo setup?
That is the million-dollar question. Personally, I would take a really high-quality stereo pair, two good bookshelf speakers, over a bottom-of-the-barrel Atmos soundbar any day. Physics still wins at the low end. Large drivers and solid cabinets will always produce better texture and bass than tiny speakers in a plastic bar trying to use software tricks. However, once you get into the mid-range soundbars, the ones in the $500 to $800 range that have actual dedicated up-firing drivers, that is where the Immersion starts to beat out traditional stereo for movies.
You mentioned up-firing drivers again. For those who aren't gearheads, those are the ones that literally point to the ceiling to bounce sound down, right?
Yes, and that is a crucial distinction. Some cheap soundbars claim to be Atmos, but they only have front-facing speakers. They use virtualization to try and make it sound like there is height. It rarely works well. If you want the real Atmos experience in a soundbar, look for a 5.1.2 or 7.1.4 system. That last number, the 2 or the 4, refers to the number of height drivers. If that number is 0, you are just getting a simulation.
What about the AI single speaker stuff we talked about? Like the Apple HomePod or the Sonos Era 300. Where do those fit in for someone who just wants a simple setup?
They are the perfect solution for music lovers in smaller spaces. A single Sonos Era 300 is surprisingly good at creating a sense of height and width because it has drivers pointing in almost every direction. But for a dedicated TV setup, a soundbar is still better because it can physically spread the speakers out across the width of your screen. The single speakers are more for lifestyle, audio filling a room with high-quality background music that feels like it is coming from everywhere at once.
It is interesting how the hardware is shrinking while the soundstage is expanding. I want to go back to the mobile thing for a minute. We talked about how phones use filters to simulate surround sound. But do you think we will ever reach a point where a phone can actually fill a room? Or are we always going to be limited by the size of those tiny diaphragms?
We are definitely fighting the laws of physics there. To move air and create deep bass, you need surface area and excursion, the distance the speaker cone moves. A phone just does not have the physical depth. But there is some really cool research into using surfaces as speakers. You know how some high-end Sony TVs use the actual glass panel as the speaker?
Yeah, they vibrate the screen itself using actuators. It makes the voices feel like they are coming directly out of the actor's mouth.
Right. Imagine if your entire desk or your coffee table could be turned into a speaker by a small actuator in your phone or a tiny puck you set down. You could use the objects around you to create the scale that the phone lacks. Combine that with the AI mapping we talked about, and you could have a very powerful system that uses your environment as the hardware. Your house becomes the speaker cabinet.
That is wild. It turns the whole room into a musical instrument. But I do wonder about the privacy implications of all this sensing. If my speaker is constantly mapping my room with microphones or ultrasonic sensors and tracking my position to optimize the sound, is that data staying on the device? Or is some company now getting a three-dimensional floor plan of my living room?
That is a very valid concern, and it is something we are seeing more discussion about in 2026. Most of the companies doing this claim the processing happens locally on the device's silicon. For example, Apple's computational audio happens on their H-series or S-series chips, and they claim the raw audio data never leaves the device. But as these systems get more complex and start using cameras or more advanced sensors to track users, we have to be vigilant. An acoustic map of your home can actually reveal a lot, where your furniture is, how big the rooms are, even how many people are in the room.
Definitely. It is the classic trade-off between convenience and privacy. We get this incredible, immersive sound that follows us around the house, but the cost might be a little more data than we are comfortable sharing. It is something to keep an eye on as smart homes become sensing homes.
It is something to watch for sure. But from a purely technical standpoint, the progress is just staggering. We have gone from mono radio to having a cinema-grade sound processor in our pockets in less than a century. The math that allows a pair of earbuds to recreate a cathedral is just mind-blowing.
It really is. I remember my dad being so proud of his massive floor-standing speakers in the 80s. They were the size of small refrigerators, and they were finished in that dark wood grain. Now, I have a little cylinder on my shelf that probably has more processing power than his entire stereo system combined.
And it probably sounds more immersive too, even if it cannot match the raw, chest-thumping bass of those old refrigerators. There is a certain soul to those old analog systems, but for sheer, you are there. Realism, modern spatial audio is winning.
So, for the listeners who are thinking about their own setups, what is the takeaway? If they want to dip their toes into 360-degree sound without spending a fortune, where should they start?
I would say the easiest entry point is a good pair of headphones that support spatial audio. If you have a modern smartphone and a decent pair of noise-canceling headphones, you can experience Dolby Atmos right now through most streaming services. It is the most controlled environment for the tech to work. If you want to move to the living room, a mid-range soundbar with dedicated up-firing drivers is the sweet spot for most people. Look for that Atmos logo, but also look for the physical number of drivers. Avoid the ones that say Virtual Atmos if you can afford to step up one level.
And if you are an audiophile like Herman, you just spend your weekends moving furniture and measuring reflections until your family thinks you have lost your mind.
Hey, it is a legitimate hobby. And when you hear that perfect soundstage where the singer feels like they are standing exactly 5 feet in front of you and the drummer is 3 feet behind them to the left, it is all worth it. It is like sonic time travel.
I will take your word for it. I think I am happy with my soundbar for now, but I do appreciate the engineering that goes into it much more after this chat. It is not just a speaker, it is a tiny little acoustic scientist sitting under my TV, constantly doing math so I can enjoy my action movies.
That is exactly what it is. A scientist that never sleeps and only wants to make your movies sound better.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the early days of cinema surround sound to the AI-driven future of single-speaker immersion. It is a fascinating field, and it is only getting more complex as software takes over from hardware.
Absolutely. And I suspect that in another few years, we will be talking about even more advanced systems that can track multiple people in a room and give each person a unique, personalized audio experience without headphones. The tech is moving that fast.
That would be something. No more fighting over the best seat in the house because every seat is the best seat.
That is the dream, Corn. That is the dream. Total acoustic equity.
Well, thank you all for listening to this deep dive into the world of sound. We really appreciate you joining us for episode 716. If you've been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or a rating on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us going.
It really does. And if you have any questions about audio gear or you want to tell me why my 12 recalibrations were not enough, you can always reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com. I am always happy to talk about crossover frequencies and room nodes.
You could also find all our past episodes and our contact form at myweirdprompts.com. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you get your podcasts.
Thanks again to Daniel for the prompt. This was a fun one to geek out on. I might go move my subwoofer another inch to the right now.
Oh boy, here we go again. We will be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep your ears open and your speakers calibrated.
Or at least move your bookshelf 3 inches to the left. Just try it and see if the imaging improves.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.